Hello, welcome, and Ramadan Mubarak, everyone. My name is Michael Vasquez. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm the Religion Faith Director at the Human Rights Campaign. Thank you for joining us, and Muslims for Progressive Values for Firmly for Justice, Ramadan Reflections on LGBTQ Justice. The Quran in Surah An-Nisa says, "O you who believe, stand out firmly for justice as witnesses to Allah, even against yourselves." Tonight's conversation features some of the most dedicated leaders in the pursuit of justice, from the Oklahoma State Legislature to the academy to literature and social media, activists and thought leaders whose devotion to the liberation of the oppressed and marginalized people around the world inspires us all. Standing firmly for justice means committing to the work of liberation wherever it might take us. This is work that is uncomfortable. This is work that is grueling and demanding. This is work that requires sacrifice. And thus, Ramadan is a reorienting to the foundations of this work, a re-examination of our priorities that we might be in alignment with Allah's call to the work of defending the vulnerable and creating societies that are just and equitable, where the dignity of all is affirmed and respected. Tonight, we give special attention to Muslim communities around the world that continue to face an onslaught of violence, oppressive policies, marginalization, and Islamophobia. In China, the Uyghur Muslims have been enduring a vicious and highly choreographed genocide at the hands of the state. Meanwhile, in France, the French Senate has passed a ban on Muslim girls from wearing hijab, escalating its deeply entrenched Islamophobic, misogynist, and misogynoir policies that have been escalating for over a decade. And just in the past few days, the world has, mostly silently so, witnessed a vicious attack on Palestinians in the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. The violence in the middle of the holiest month in the Islamic calendar escalated with an attack on Muslims praying in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest site in Islam. Personally, as a descendant of both African and indigenous communities who were forcefully removed from their lands, forced into labor, and stripped of their heritage and customs, these attacks resound for me on a profound level. The freedom to worship, free from violence, the freedom to peacefully inhabit one's home without the threat of violent expulsion. But then the threat comes back home as well, as we look at over 30 states that have been pushing forward over 120 pieces of anti-trans legislation at the state level. What we have been witnessing this year, in the last couple of days, the last few weeks, and the last several months, in the aftermath of the turnover to a new administration, is the devastation left behind by a previous political regime and the deep work that remains to be done to create a world that is just and equitable. The work that is in front of us is beyond just what one president or one organization or one institution is responsible for. But we are working towards creating intersectional LGBTQ justice for the world, repairing decades and centuries of harm against the Black community, indigenous communities, the Muslim community, Latinx communities. And as we discussed tonight, Muslim LGBTQ people who live at the intersection of multiple marginalized communities and yet testify to us about the possibilities of hope, the possibilities of justice, and a future that is safe and equitable for everyone. I'm excited for tonight's conversation because as we wade through inspiring dialogue and into difficult conversation, we might walk away with the instruction and the inspiration and the grit to continue to press on in the work of liberation. With that, it is my great joy and honor to introduce a dear friend who is and has been a leader in this work for quite some time now. Inspiring others to continue to press forward in this work. Zonneveld is a writer and singer and songwriter, founder and president of Muslims for Progressive Values, an international human rights organization that advocates for social justice and equality for all, a strong supporter of freedom of expression, of conscience, women's rights, and as an ally, LGBTQ rights. ANE promotes these values of the United Nations by challenging human rights abuses in the name of Islam and by offering an inclusive understanding based on universal human rights and justice. It is so great to work together, ANE. Welcome. Take it away.
Thank you, Michael. And as always, I'm very happy that with this annual tradition that we've been keeping up of this interfaith iftars that MPV and Human Rights Campaign have been holding together, I think for about 5 years now. But our partnership between MPV and Human Rights Campaign has gone on for a good 10 years, long before Muslims have organized in support of LGBT rights. And for me personally, it is very dear to my heart as far as human rights for all, and in particular LGBT rights. And here in California in 2008, how I've been at the forefront of marriage equality long before it was the cool thing to do. But we have this fantastic panel gathered here, and I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the work that we do at MPV. But before I get into that, the first thing is I'm going to open up with Al-Fatiha in Arabic, which is the first verse of the Quran, followed by the English translation. What's important about this verse is that it talks about walking the straight path. And oftentimes we forget what walking the straight path means. And it's basically urging society, individuals to come to life, to live a life in a pure and pure and with integrity and without hypocrisy. And so it's not an easy path to walk. And I therefore will start opening up with the Al-Fatiha in Arabic. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahmanir Rahim. Maliki Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين. And in English, this is a translation by Sir Richard Burton. Praise be to God who all the worlds made, gracious, the merciful, the compassionate, King and Queen of the day of faith. Only thee do we adore, and only thee do we crave aid. Guide us to the path which is straight, the path of those for whom thy love is great, not those on whom is hate, nor they that deviate. Amen. So, how do we not deviate from the straight path? The only way, as Michael beautifully quoted a verse from the Quran about justice, standing up for justice even if it's against your own self-interest. This is a very tough path to walk. And many of you in the panel here are doing just that. And I commend you for doing that. I'm going to talk about briefly about the politics here in the United States. We have seen the conclusion that more American Muslims voted for Trump in the second elections than the first election, from 16% in 2016 to 31% in 2020. And when I asked my conservative, traditional, but yet LGBT ally imam, why did this number go up? And the conclusion he got was that the response he received from them was, number one, they did not subscribe to the Black Lives Matter agenda. And number two, they didn't subscribe, nor do they support the quote unquote, the LGBTQI agenda. And so MPV has been doing this work on LGBT rights for a very long time, for more than 15 years, and we've produced a lot of content that are human rights affirming of LGBT in the context of Islam. And it is obviously conclusive that we still have a lot of work to do. And it is a pity that for Muslims who are conservative, who are traditional and mosque goers, instead of instead of really adhering to the call for human rights and for social justice, as the Quran calls for all human beings to do, they have decided that it is to fall on the side of injustice. And so therefore we have a lot of work to do in order to sway and to win over their hearts in this regard. I'm going to focus in the United States and not so much in international politics, because as Michael said, I do a lot of that at the United Nations, encountering a lot of the human rights abuses and Sharia law in the name of Islam. We have a lot of inclusive Islam content that we've produced theologically, and we need to address further, however, within the Muslim community itself, how do we reach the conservative Muslims that are not subscribing to this inclusive and human rights rooted Islam? The one thing that we've done since the Pulse shooting, we've rolled out an initiative called No Hate in My Faith. No Hate in My Faith, in which we really challenge religious and Muslim institutions and religious leaders to sign up to this philosophy and idea of an Islam that is rooted in human rights, where we do away with all forms of hate speech to the other, whoever the other is, whether it be Sunni on Shia, Sunni on Ahmadiyya, Muslims on African Americans, on Jews, on whoever, on atheists, whoever that other is. We really need to do away with hate. We've seen how hate has perpetuated itself. We've seen the killing of the shooting at the African American church, at the Jewish synagogue, and so on and so forth. There really is no place for hate speech in the name of religion, regardless of what that religion is. What we've also done is we've launched an MPV Urdu. Urdu is spoken in 130 million Muslims and non-Muslims, but primarily Muslims. And what we've decided to do is to interpret and translate a lot of our content on our website into Urdu, because even here in the United States, we still get requests from mental health experts who are looking for Urdu content to support LGBT issues in conflict resolutions that they're having to deal with between LGBT folks and their Urdu-speaking parents. And thirdly, this is something that I've ventured on a personal effort, and that is to develop an inclusive Islam curriculum rooted in human rights, as I feel that the only way for us as Muslims, and I'm very much focused on the inward looking, because we can't resolve the issues of human rights until we ourselves subscribe to human rights for all. And so this inclusive Islam curriculum addresses the issues of diversity of all of God's creations and the love and compassionate God of this marvelous creator that we have, and how we as human beings need to be just as loving and compassionate to all of God's creations, including the environment and including the animal kingdom. And so with that, I want to conclude to say that thank you again, Human Rights Campaign and the panelists, for making themselves available. I want to wish everyone a wonderful iftar for tonight, and happy Eid, which is coming up on Wednesday. We have an Eid event next Saturday with LGBT affirming families and allies. So check out our calendar for that event. Thank you. Good night.
All righty. Well, that was such lovely words from Ani. Unfortunately, you were muted, Michael. So we're going to have you do a little reset, unmute yourself, and then we'll get the show back on the road. All right. You'll see me in a little bit.
Thank you, Blair. Apologize for that. It is my distinct honor to introduce Rep. Mauree Turner from the 88th House District of the great state of Oklahoma. We're so happy to have you. Take it away.
Thank you. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I think I want to start with something that I've been thinking a lot about, I think specifically during the time of Ramadan. One of my favorite verses is Surah 2, Ayah 177, but something that's really been resonating with me, I think specifically this Ramadan and this Oklahoma session, is Surah 5, Ayah 48. And I'll just go ahead and read in English. My Arabic is honestly not too good. So it says, "And we have revealed to you, O Muhammad, the book in truth, confirming that which preceded it of the scripture and as its criterion over it. So judge between them by what Allah has revealed to you. Do not follow their inclinations away from what has come to you of the truth. To each of you, we prescribed a law and a method. Had Allah willed it, he would have made you of one nation, one united religion. But he intended to test you and what he has given you. So race to all that is good. To Allah it is your return altogether, and he then will inform you concerning that over which you used to differ." Right? And so I think of this one specifically during Oklahoma's session time, right? And what it means to really care for community, because being the first Muslim in Oklahoma's legislature is tough, right? And being the first queer Muslim and the first non-binary person coming into Oklahoma specifically legislature is really tough. But the number one thing is that we have a prayer and a sermon each week, and then we go into asking questions on bills, and we talk about why we care about writing these bills and why we pass them, right? Or why we should urge people to vote against them, right? And the number one thing that we hear, or some of the number one arguments we hear from some of the members, right, is we will have folks get up and read the Bible and talk about why it's important that we pass this bill to strip away people's access to rights to an equitable life, right? And they do this with the Bible in hand and with sermons and scriptures right there with them, right? And for me, I think this sort of this ayah specifically really sticks out to me, especially during the month of Ramadan, is because I am working in a building with folks from a different religious walk of life, right? And this is what Allah had planned, right? Is that we will come from differing religions, right? But we are to seek out God. We are to seek out what is good and what is just continuously. And that is how I do my work every day, right? Remembering that it's not about being in that building, right? But it's about being able to give power back to the community, right? And that is so much of what Islam tells us, right? To be able to take care of one another, to give away our wealth whenever we can, right? To those who need us, right? To keep our promises. And my promise as a community organizer is to always take care of my community, right? My family, the folks of House District 88 who are physically here, and all of our honorary members around the world, right? Is the importance of being able to take care of each other, right? And so I think about this in the type of work that we all engage in, right? Whether we are community activists, right? Whether we are trying to find our place in the movement. And that is so important, to be able to keep community at the base of all of that, right? And be able to think about it, what it looks like for you and your walk of life, right? But also the intersections that you might not hold. I think one thing I say a lot, right, is that our liberation is tied together. And that's because in every walk of life, right, we are not just like, there's no such thing as someone who is just Muslim, right? We are people, and we are not a monolith, right? We have queer Muslims, we have Muslims that are LGBTQ2S+, we've got Black Muslims, right? We've got incarcerated Muslims. And we should be fighting for all of these things, right? We should think about those intersections, right? Think about our impoverished siblings, especially during the time of Ramadan, and take that out of Ramadan with us, right? And so these are the things that really guide my work, right? And community is the foundation of all of that, right? And so a lot of people, some people know, some people don't. I grew up in a household, my mother Baptist, my dad Muslim, and my dad was in and out of prison up until I was in middle school, I think maybe around grade 7. And so I grew up with a dad that was behind the razor wire, my dad and my granddad, but grew up with so much knowledge around it too, right? And so that was my earliest form of community organizing, one of my earliest forms of community organizing. Was being able to see my dad and what that looked like and how to care for him, right? Inside of that system, and why it's important that we take care of families who have incarcerated loved ones, right? We take care of our loved ones who are incarcerated and what that living condition within our justice system looks like, right? As well as leaving that justice system, right? What it looks like to be able to get back into society, right? Because so much changes, right, on the day-to-day basis. And once you're behind that razor wire, it feels like it happens a lot quicker. So all of this really kind of shaped who I am as a person and why I care so deeply about this work, right? And for me, I think the big intersection, right, is the intersection of Islam and the carceral system, and for me specifically, Oklahoma's carceral system. But I also understand that there are so many intersections within that, right? And I don't do the work justice, and I don't do my siblings in this fight justice if I am not doing everything that I can do to make sure that we are also centering those intersections, right? And making sure that, understanding that I don't know everything, right? I hold a lot of intersections, but I do not know everything. And so I'm constantly in community and organizing with and working with and for people who don't have the same walk of life as me, right? And this is really important for the type of work that we do, right? And this is something I have found out at a very, very young age, right? So I said that intersection of Islam and in our carceral system, our prison industrial complex, is one of my big foundations, but also in elementary school, if I was missing school, my mom worked 3 jobs, and one of those was she was an administrative person for our health department. And so we spent a lot of time at conferences, right, learning and growing in the 90s and trying to educate ourselves about the AIDS epidemic, right, and realizing what that looked like and how to really care for folks. And so a lot of, in elementary school, a lot of my time was spent in community, right? And at community listening conversations and creating space for our LGBTQ plus loved ones and to see how to show up and how to care for them in a holistic manner, right? And so being intersectional is not something I'm new to, right? But I think it's really important that we make sure that we're continuously looking through a lot of different lenses and bringing our loved ones in that have different lenses from us, right? To be able to do this work in an equitable manner. So I'll say that. That's what I'll say. And then I guess we'll move forward. Sorry.
Nothing to apologize about at all. That was incredible, and thank you so much. And we can, we'll get started with the panel now to keep expanding on that incredible dialogue that we've already started with. I think in particular, what immediately jumps to mind is what you said about community organizing at its core is caring not just for us, right, like our people, but for all people in need. And so. But yeah, let's get going. I want to first introduce Dr. Melissa Hafaf, who is the program director of the Georgetown University Gender Plus Justice Initiative, where she also teaches women and gender studies courses. She holds a bachelor's degree in sociology and philosophy from the University of Paris for La Sorbonne. You're going to have to edit my French, Melissa. And a doctorate in literary, cultural, and linguistic studies with a focus on gender from the University of Miami. Her dissertation entitled Shifting Masculinities from North Africa examined the discourse and literary representations of masculinity in post-colonial Algeria, Egypt, and Morocco. Dr. Hafaf's research interests include North African cultural productions, Islamic studies, gender studies, feminist theory and praxis, and decolonial and racial theory. Welcome, Melissa. And then I'd like to next introduce Blair Money, who's a critically acclaimed historian, author, educator, and influencer. Welcome, Blair. The New York Times praises Blair Money's unique ability to create progressive lessons with vibrant visuals and perky, quirky delivery. Her viral microlearning series, Smarter in Seconds, demonstrates her signature style of making abstract concepts more concrete in a well-researched, well-presented, and concise manner, for which we are incredibly grateful. I've learned so much from them personally, so thank you. Welcome, Blair. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to get started. And so what I want to begin with is with everyone here shared at the beginning of Ramadan some different notes to kick off this holy month. And so Representative Turner, I want to start with you. You wrote on Instagram, my intention for Ramadan every year is to grow deeper in knowledge about myself, my siblings, and my deen. I want that for you too. Always remember, we don't get to pick and choose who crosses the finish line of liberation with us. And like you just said in your remarks, our liberation is tied together. Can you share some more about what you feel like you have learned so far this Ramadan, and what lessons you might offer in particular to LGBTQ, to queer and trans Muslims, and then to the Muslim community more broadly about the work of liberation?
For sure. I think one of the major lessons that I've learned, I think, this Ramadan is that it's a lot easier to be able to do the work, right? The freedom dreaming, right? And actually putting that into action with folks that you've worked with, right? The thing I love about community organizing is that I've been able to create this really great network of people that are doing this hard-hitting work here in Oklahoma for the past few years, right? And now I'm in a new arena altogether at the Oklahoma legislature with, I guess, 18 new friends, and we get to do this work, right? But also realizing that everybody who wants to join into this work, right, isn't at the same level as you, and that sounds weird actually. But everybody doesn't come into this work with the same lenses, right? With the same intersectional lenses, should I say? And so it feels like every few years I get a kind of reset. I think as a Capricorn, a lot of the times I'm like, it's common sense. And then I have to talk to myself and be like, this is not common sense for everybody, stop. So realizing that, I think, is like one of the big things that I've had to take a hold of again. And also realizing that organizing is, especially when we talk about relational organizing, it is about changing the hearts and minds, right, of our friends and our loved ones, about what it means to truly care for people, or why you care so deeply about a situation, right? And your hope is that your friends and your family and your loved ones will be able to say like, oh, okay, I didn't realize that, right? Or I wasn't looking at it with these lenses. That makes sense to me now. And it's a lot harder to do that work with someone who doesn't want to talk to you in the first place, right? Or doesn't see you as human or whole. And so trying to figure out, right, how to penetrate that surface sometimes, but also realizing, right, to take care of yourself and to do this work is that you don't have to relive trauma in order to educate someone, right? And so some of our work is not just about changing the hearts and minds of people, right, but about moving around them, right, and changing the hearts and minds of their communities to be able to elect new officials, right? And so that's like specifically in the political field, but like when I'm thinking about what this work looks like specifically in Islam, we think about the racism in Islam, right? And it's not something that no other culture or no other religion has to deal with, right? But we think about the racism in Islam, or the homophobia or anti-LGBTQ2S movements that kind of happen around that, and understanding, right, that we do not serve a monolith, and these religion does not exist in a monolith, right? If you care about religious freedom and if you care about maintaining those rights to access that, then you have to fight for all of our siblings, right? Not just the ones you like, which is why I think I always say, right, that you don't get to pick and choose who crosses that finish line of liberation with us, right? If we really care about doing this work, and if we're really dedicated to it, right, then we understand that we are fighting for access to the rights that everybody else gets, right? When we are on this soil here in America, we are making sure that we are creating a comfortable living for everybody. Because I'm a firm believer that there is a way that you can write policy that dictates people's everyday lives, right? And also do it from a place of minding your own business, right? So I think it's really important to realize that there's a distinct difference in using policy to oppress others, right? Under the guise or under the guise of doing justice for everybody, right? And actively doing justice for everybody, right? And I think we see that with some of the policies that are going on throughout the nation, but I'm still kind of very policy minded, so I'll try to step away from that. But I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. And you can say as policy minded as you feel like you need to. So no worries. That is your field. You are a rep. So, but actually on that same line, right, like to carry on that same thread, Blair, you posted Allah created LGBTQIA plus folks, right? And it's simple, right? Like it's 4 words, right? It's 3 words in an acronym. And so like some folks like that might be simple, but like it is a profound, powerful declaration of the humanity and dignity of our community. Full stop, right? Like that carries weight. It is significant. And particularly now, right, like speaking of legislation, right, where there's a sweeping concerted effort to attack trans youth around the country. It has been going on for the last several months. What do you wish people would take away from Ramadan in particular in light of what we're seeing? Like how might Ramadan and Islam more broadly serve as a means to understand, right, from your perspective, the work of liberation and justice, and creating, whether it's policy change or whether it's intracommunal, creating spaces that are more equitable for queer and trans youth?
Well, I think for myself, speaking to the quote and my first week experience of Ramadan, the first week of Ramadan rather, I had 2 very interesting experiences back to back. The first Sunday of Ramadan, I was invited to a socially distanced iftar by a group of folks who are not necessarily in the LGBTQ community. Everyone there was an ally, and it was one of the first times where I felt the same feeling before I was out. Where before I came out in 2017, very publicly on Fox News, which I do not recommend, I felt just Muslim. And it's not to say like I was erasing my other parts of who I am, but I could be present and speak and be there for Allah first and not feel like I had to justify my existence. And I felt that again. And I think that's really beautiful and important to say, because there is such a scourge of queer antagonistic spaces within various religious communities, and there's a lot of trauma there. And even somebody who, like myself, like literally wearing a rainbow hijab, like I still experienced that, and that was a really beautiful thing to not have to experience. Of course, the next day, I am getting notifications from my followers that a prominent troll who's also Muslim decides to spend his first day of Ramadan going after LGBTQ Muslims. And the video's still up because there's such a lax relationship between YouTube and people who are literally doing hate speech. But my videos as a queer person talking about queer issues get demonetized, get deplatformed. And that was honestly a challenge where I went from having to deal with my own trauma and dealing with the prejudices of community that are valid that I have to, go through, and not duplicate this idea of a monolith like Rep. Mauree was just talking about, but really experience individuals as individuals. And then the next day, I'm experiencing that same trauma once more. And it's Ramadan. So I want to cuss these people out, but I'm on my best behavior. And so how do I process that? And truly, it was just a moment of me sitting there and reflecting, and not a matter of swallowing my pride or whatever that means, but really walking in my pride, but also in humility. And sitting there and looking at my ego and going, I'm feeling personally attacked, but this is not personal. This is about the prejudices that this individual has decided to displace onto other people and use me as the target. And what I came out of that reflection and that prayer process, which is what Ramadan is all about, which is reflection, I stopped and I sat there and I said, it is an honor to be able to be myself every single day. period. And it is an honor to do that, especially because so many people like our queer and trans youth cannot do that, or are at constant threat for doing that, where the United States Congress, those of the leaders who are in the pocket of the NRA, would rather look at everyday trans and queer people as a greater threat to the livelihood of children who are themselves are queer and trans than literal assault rifles that are being used to mow them down in mass shootings. It's nonsensical. And so I think that when we can remember to take it's a personal attack, but it's not about us. It is about the myths they've created about us. It is about the lies they've created about us. It is about these untruths. And that is applied broadly, whether we're looking at the hijab ban in France. Oh, well, let's go ahead and attack this freedom of expression and assume that it's completely patriarchally enforced and infantilize an entire community of people while also having a lower age of consent for sexual interaction, and call ourselves a land of liberté and inequality. And so that's what Ramadan has been about for me, is looking at these truths and how they're fundamentally in a disassociation with my lived experiences, and having to come forward from that in a way that I'm not allowing myself to cuss people out about. It's hard. And the biggest thing I think we can take away from it, with all that considered, is to look inward. Whether that is, I often talk with my students about having a personal identity and a social identity. Who you are personally is immutable. And that's the message I say. God created us. God does not make mistakes. And it's not that homophobic, transphobic statement of God doesn't make mistakes, so don't transition, don't get it twisted. It's that you are who you are, whether or not who you are is able to be expressed on the outside in the current moment or not. And whether or not people view you and accept you socially doesn't change who you are and who God needs you to be. And on that journey through life, we will, uncover and experience that, and it may change, and that is absolutely beautiful and okay. But who we are cannot be changed. And it's also an intersection that non-Muslims, people who are attacking our communities, people who are being homophobic and transphobic, regardless of whether in our communities or not, need to reflect upon. Why do you view us as so threatening when these actual threats, like child marriage being legal in way too many states in the United States, in 46 states, we're literally looking at a law that makes it so somebody who commits statutory rape can marry the person that they've predated and then no longer have charges taken against them? That is legal in 46 states with some variation state by state. That is a real threat to children. That is actually affecting white, Christian, evangelical Christian, Republican children. Those kids that these laws that are transphobic and homophobic claim to be going to protect. So it's a misdirection. It's any way of being able to control bodies, expression, belief, and put it all into a pretty package, concealing this horrible grime with a package that says we're caring about the kids while also letting abuse go rampantly. But it's remembering that it's not because of who we are, it's because of the systems we exist in.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Which, connects me to what I want to ask you, Melissa, but also something else, right? Shout out, Rep. Turner said earlier, shout out Future Dreams, about our collective project, right? As we see this broader work that impacts not just us, or doesn't impact just the queer youth that we're fighting for and we're talking about now, right? Like Blair said, there are so many more people who are impacted, and so if we broaden our lens of and our scope of our liberation work, what might we be able to accomplish? Melissa, you wrote, thinking of my fellow Muslims who are alone, imprisoned, and oppressed, from China to France and everywhere else, may we dream, pray, and materialize a future where radical love and care and dignity for all is at the center of our collective project. Our collective project, again, is the liberation of all people. As an academic, as an activist, where do you see the roots of our global struggle for liberation for gender and sexual minorities? And what lessons or insight do you think that Ramadan offers us in our collective struggle? And whether that's, you want to jump in on talking about what's happening in France or elsewhere, what are the lessons and insight you think Ramadan's offering us right now?
Thank you so much for having me, Human Rights Campaigns and Muslims for Progressive Values. I'm very excited to be with you today. I think I'm going to sort of repeat some of the things that Representative Turner and Blair Marnie said in terms of what it means to, I mean, what Ramadan means as a larger sort of reflection and a month where that is the most sacred, that we take time to go inward, but it's also about modesty. It's about trying to put yourself in this other state, right, and experiencing what it is to lack, and it gives you sort of perspective. It's also about solidarity, which I think Islam is about solidarity as a larger project, and it's also one of the reasons why I was born, quote unquote, a Muslim, whatever that means. But then I sort of reaffirmed to really choose to be a Muslim for almost political reasons, and because of the radical equality and the radical social justice message of Islam. We're not supposed to just be here as Muslims and not do anything about the world. We are supposed to make it better than we found it. It's really, I think, that for me, and again, I'm not a religious authority. I am not a representative of Muslims, because I think it would be so reductive to even pretend to do that, especially in the United States, where the community is extremely diverse. And I think we should be even talking about communities rather than a community. But then I think there is a core of a message of this radical equality and social justice motto, and that we have to do. We can't escape it. So in this sense, this year I've been thinking, because I think, first of all, Muslims in the US, but then all over the place, we're talking about Muslim majority countries, or then communities who are being oppressed. And again, I don't want to make big generalization, but clearly there is a lot of things going on here in France, that is also my country. And then, as you mentioned in your introduction, the horrendous, unbearable images that we've been seeing from Jerusalem, but also the Uyghur genocide that we don't even have much information about, beyond the other, and Afghanistan and Iraq and all the places. There are still so many Muslims who are being oppressed. And it's incredible, because I feel even the images from Palestine, or from Jerusalem in this case, or from the West Bank, it's like, we all know that if we were to be another community, another religious community, we wouldn't have the same response. It wouldn't be covered the same way in the media. So I think there is an inherent Islamophobic in general, and that's coming from the Crusades all the way up to the Enlightenment of French philosophy or Western thought, to then we keep on carrying, and then colonialism, and then post-colonialism. Sorry, I'm an educator, so I always have to do these. Let's go back to the bigger genealogy of all this, because these are not just singular elements that all of a sudden people are looking at this community a certain way. No, it's we know they're communities of color, then we know they're vulnerable communities, so it's much easier to be tapping on that, because we don't have the possibility to defend ourselves the same way other communities may be, or have gained this type of power. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm rambling and going all over the place, but
go ahead.
because it's very complex. And then I want to go back to France, because I think it's also important. And I know we're trying to focus on LGBTQ communities, and I think same thing. There is so much to be done, so much work to be done, and so much education to be done, because I think homophobia is inherent to all cultures. Let's not pretend it's the imperialist capitalist patriarchy that's doing that. We are not about. So in the Muslim community, we see it appearing in certain forms, but I also don't want to be looking at, Muslims are more homophobic than certain other communities, because we see it, especially in the United States, how conservative some people can be. So I think I think homophobia is a phenomenon that we really need to fight, and the anti-trans everywhere, and the only way is education. Because I think once people get educated and concerned, and I see it when I teach intro to women and gender studies classes, when you see people, usually it's the people who are a little bit aware who are going to take that class, let's not lie. But you will still have sometimes this one person who's just, why not, let me see. And they're actually kind of shocked to understand about all of these social constructions and how, and then you're like, oh, wow, why would I even think that? I think it was Representative Turner earlier who was saying, but why is that bothering you so much? Why do you feel that you are so compelled to create a whole policy about something that you weren't even thinking about before, actually. And now all of a sudden, it's become an emergency to be creating all of these laws that are literally going to traumatize, as if children were not enough, as Blair was saying. There's a lot of other things that are actually happening we should actually putting our attention on, but then the issue is trans children. So yeah, all this to say that education, I think, and going back to Ramadan, and to me, I think that's the only way we can change the world, because we can do all the laws at some point. A lot of times laws are always kind of not necessarily matching the people's mentality at the time, and we see it a lot of progressive actually bills are passed, and then you take 20 years for actually everybody to believe in that. So there is that needs to be done. And just a quick parenthesis about France. I think clearly I'm French and Algerian, so I was born in Algeria, then I moved to France in the late 90s because we had a civil war in Algeria, and but then my connection to France is ongoing because my grandfather fought in World War I and then was called back to work as an immigrant. So my mother was born in France. Sorry, I'm just giving you a little bit of the context of my life. But so it's, and I think you cannot be Algerian and not have a connection to France, because the colonization was so deep. And what we see right now is just a continuation of the colonial project, unfortunately. We've been trying to unveil the Algerian woman in the 19th century, and we're still doing it 100 years or 200 years, later, because we don't want to look at the real issues. And at the end of the day, France is a deeply racist country. It has been a colonizer, continues to do so in many ways, shapes, or form. And right now, what's happening in Europe in terms of the rise of the far right, I don't think it's just a rise. I think it's always been there, because we haven't done the work of education after World War II. We have never done the work about colonization. I got maybe 2 classes in high school about what happened in Algeria. And for the longest time, we used to call it the events of Algeria, when it's a war that lasted 8 years and killed over 1 million Algerians. So it's all of these layers of things that's not just like, oh, Macron and his government are all of a sudden becoming Islamophobic. No, it's been a long trace. Since the 80s, actually, we've been starting to put that at the forefront of the media to distract instead of taking. And by the way, also last week, or no, a few days ago, I mean this week, sorry, because I'm like, what day are we? We're Saturday. We passed a law in France to ban inclusive writing. I don't know if you are aware of that, so we put the feminine and the masculine, and you would put a dot and then to just include the feminine and the plural in an adjective or in a noun, because, it's a very gendered language. And they banned this. And it's like, we're in a pandemic. People are starving. This is really what my Ministry of Education has on the first priority of his agenda. And to ban something, I mean, it's just ridiculous. All this to say that, sorry, I went I'm just so enraged every time I watch the French news. I mean, every day, basically. I'm enraged by what's happening here, and I'm enraged by what's happening in Jerusalem. But France has been, I think all of my Muslim fellows are feeling, it's persecution at this point. It's every day you have a news story about Muslim people that is already a very vulnerable community. And now you're like, what do you want? What exactly do you want? So I hope that we can do some work, though, and this is why I think it's super important to build also international solidarities, which I've been trying to do through my work, because I think, intersectional, I think Black feminism is going to save us all in that sense. I mean, this is the only way, and decolonial feminism. And I think because all of the struggles, even if they're very specific, and I don't want to, again, generalize, it's still about oppression. We're all trying to liberate ourselves. And there's also a few things that some groups may have learned that other groups could be using to fight for their liberation. And I think especially when it comes to the French Muslim communities, LGBTQ included, I think we don't have much of that power that in the US we have gained along the time, or a long time, because of the very specific and many. So yeah, that's all I'll say. Sorry, I feel I went.
No.
I try to
reaffirm that nobody here has anything to apologize for. Like, this is what the space is so that we can have this dialogue and have this conversation. I have a lot of thoughts. I think, but just initially, right, I think there's something about like what you're saying in this global solidarity movement, right, that we can see reflected in the movement for Black Lives globally, and the BLM global network that has really developed this system of global solidarity that when BLM or M4BL is talking about liberation work, it includes, right, ecological justice, it includes LGBTQ justice, it includes justice, disability justice, right? I think it is on us, right, like that the closed captioning is not working correctly, right now on this live stream. It makes it difficult for folks who need that service to be able to access this material, right? Like, and I take responsibility for that, right? When we talk about intersectional justice, right, like the reason why like Rep. Turner or Blair or Melissa, when you're like, all these other threads are coming out about all these other policy issues or historical dynamics, like it's because that is the fundamental work of intersectionality, that we have to address these things. And so there are a couple of things I want to address with, like, we're running short on time, so I want to go through everyone one more time with a final question, and I'll frame it like this. Again, stuff that I'm just drawing from what y'all have already said, right? But the work of building global solidarity really is rooted in, right, Melissa, what you just so aptly said. How do we teach one another how to build political power? That isn't, and like when I say political power, I'm not just talking about like, like political parties and political structures and political systems. Right, like just so for folks listening, like the broader construct of how do we take back power, those of us who have been oppressed, those of us who have been marginalized, how do we take back sovereignty of our own lives, agency over our own lives and of our communities, right? And I think, right, in particular, right, like there's so many things to be angry about, like consistently, and so like, but I think right now in this moment, right, like I think of the videos that I was looking, there's a lot of videos on Instagram that I was watching about what's happening in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. And then of children, right, praying, children playing on their streets, right? I think part of what we've discussed, right, in the battle to fight back these anti-trans bills on the state level, particularly the anti-trans sports bills, about letting the kids play, right? That applies to the maybe queer, maybe not queer, maybe trans, maybe not trans children, right, who are trying to play on their street in East Jerusalem and are not able to because of the violence, because of what we are seeing play out right now, right? I believe deeply that the morality of a nation is indicated by how it cares for its children, but also, right, by extension, how it cares for another community's children, right? How you treat not your own babies, but like somebody else's babies, like that is an indication of your morality, right? And I think we saw that play out last year, right, in this new, like in a heightened wave of anti-Black police violence, and of whom, like, where we saw queer and trans folks victim to that same violence, but a movement that rose up too, right? Like I think it was in the face of those horrors, we saw the largest movement in the history of the world rise up globally to respond, and then not a couple of weeks ago, we saw a guilty verdict in the Derek Chauvin murder case, which for some folks that came out as a sign of victory, kind of a moment of celebration, but more realistically, I think better put a moment where there was a sigh of relief at best, but a recognition that true justice was not issued in that moment, right? And that as we continue to press on, right, when we talk about intersectional justice in light of, right, of systems that themselves exist only to preserve themselves and not to transform into actual equitable and just systems, our fight moving forward, right, like Blair said earlier, not just during Ramadan, but like beyond, after Ramadan's over, right, how do we keep on keeping on in this work, is intersectional justice that ties in the work in defense of Black lives, in defense of queer lives, and in our collective project, to use Melissa's words, for global liberation. Just want to create space in light of that, right? Like for folks to have a final word of whether inspiration or exhortation, right? Like press the people, right? Or inspire the people. How might we take Ramadan, right, forward, right? And the lessons of Islam for justice and global solidarity, building power towards liberation. What might you all say? We'll start with you, Rep. Turner.
That's a good one. I think in moving forward, right, the things to take beyond Ramadan for me, right, is quite honestly the fact that to realize that we are doing a lot of good work, right, in our own communities, and sometimes we have to take a step outside of it, and that's when the work gets extremely harder, right? And so to have that grace in that space with yourself, right? I always try to remind myself to extend the same grace to myself that I want for everybody else. And so being gentle with yourself in that respect, right? Because it is hard work. It is you are playing the long game. And so if you can't show up physically, right, then you can't help us do the work, right? So making sure that you're taking care of yourself in it all too.
Thank you. Blair?
I think that's very important, and to layer on top or next to is not to expect yourself to be everything to everyone. One, because you will lose every time and then be burnt out because you'll be disappointed that you could not fulfill something that was impossible to fulfill in the first place. And the second thing is it's okay to sit in your good works, right? Not to say, oh, I've done enough now, but to recall that if you're doing the work of decolonization, of fighting anti-indigeneity and fighting anti-Blackness, you are also, if you're doing it right, inherently fighting for countless other aspects of this work. And whether you specifically name them or not, to remember that these things are inherently aligned. And so I think often I see people try to, stack their causes into this giant stack and be like, oh, I have this and I have this and I have this. But to remember that we can truly be unified, and that if we all have individuals who are working within themselves and working externally to fight something and to do it well, then we will get free. But it does not mean that we simultaneously have to be everything to everyone and to be perfect, because perfection is a product of white supremacy, and it is not something that we are meant to fulfill, nor should we attempt to.
Brilliant. Thank you, Blair. Thank you. Melissa?
Same. I mean, I would obviously agree with what both have said. I would also want to talk actually, which Representative Turner talked about at the beginning, but dream big. We are not dreaming. And I think we are so constrained because of the capitalist machine and because of all of these structures of thinking, no, this is never going to change. We can never do. And this is not how we make revolutions. So I want people to really dare seeing the big pictures and trying to see, yeah, we want to be free. Why not? If people were able to be enslaved and liberate themselves, I think we can make the effort to dismantle this crazy system that is actually inherently coming from or connected to these institutions, and envision something else where everybody is treated with dignity and respect and love and care. And I think we make that as if it's crazy to think that way. And I want to tell people, yeah, nothing has come outside of a dream. You need a utopia to begin with. So yeah, dream and don't, yeah, we can imagine something else.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Thank you all. Absolutely. I think that a product of our condition is the difficulty to dream, but the act of dreaming and choosing in and leaning into future dreams, liberation dreams, to the Afro future and the liberation future for all, right? Is that itself is an act of resistance to the systems and the structures that we are up against. I want to thank you, Representative Turner, and Blair, and Melissa. Thank you all for an incredible conversation that really is scratching the surface of a deep conversation. Y'all went all the way deep, and I loved it. It was beautiful, and I hope it is a gift and an exhortation to all who watch, whether you're watching right now live or watching the recording at a later date. I hope that this serves as instruction and inspiration for crafting that future that we are dreaming of, and And I just want to close by saying we pray in solidarity with our siblings globally in the work for liberation as well. We pray for peace where there is not, but more greatly so, we pray for liberation from the systems of oppression that create environments and atmospheres that lack that peace that we pray for. On behalf of the Human Rights Campaign and Muslims for Progressive Values, thank you everyone, and have a good evening.